The sky was gray, heavy with the weight of morning, as if even the clouds understood the emptiness that had settled in my chest. My husband's coffin had just been lowered into the earth, and the hollow echoes of rest and peace still lingered in my ears, bouncing off the polished stones and the quiet murmurs of distant relatives. People spoke in hushed tones, their sympathy almost mechanical, like they were performing a ritual rather than feeling it. I smiled politely when they came near, nodding, letting my grief hide behind a mask of composure. But inside, the world had shattered, leaving behind fragments of a life I thought I understood. I stepped away from the cluster of mourners, moving toward the edge of the cemetery where the wind whispered through bare trees. My hands trembled slightly, whether from the cold or the raw weight of loss, I couldn't tell. That's when I noticed him, a stranger, standing alone, watching me with an intensity that made the skin on my arms crawl. He didn't look like a mourner. His suit was simple, but something about the way he carried himself suggested he was used to attention, to knowing things that others didn't. He smiled faintly, but it wasn't warm. It was calculating. "You're Sarah Bennett, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low, calm, as if stating a fact rather than asking a question. My breath caught. How did he know my name? He stepped closer, the gravel crunching under his polished shoes, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February wind. Every instinct screamed at me to step back, to run, yet something, a morbid curiosity, perhaps, kept my feet planted. This was the moment that would change everything. The stranger had arrived, and he carried questions only I could answer. But why now? And why him? The funeral had begun hours ago, but to me, time seemed to have slowed, stretching each moment into a long, heavy shadow. Black suits, whispered condolences, and the quiet shuffle of polished shoes across stone pathways formed a backdrop I could barely register. Everyone was performing their roles: the grieving widow, the supportive friends, the somber relatives, but the performance felt hollow. I watched them laugh politely at memories they barely understood, nod in agreement with statements they might not even believe. The air smelled of damp earth, lilies, and faint perfume, an odd mixture that somehow mirrored the confusion settling in my mind. My mother-in-law placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip firm, yet demanding. "You must stay strong," she said, her tone a mix of expectation and judgment. The words hit me harder than I expected. Stay strong. That was the constant demand of my life. To appear composed, to bend under invisible rules, and to smile while my world collapsed. I nodded, lips tight, eyes fixed on the casket. The people around me could not see the storm inside. My thoughts raced, questions circling endlessly. How had it come to this? Was I truly alone in the truth of my life? Or had everyone been pretending all along? Friends and acquaintances passed by, offering hugs that felt too light, murmuring words meant to console but unable to reach the raw reality of loss. Each comment, each "I'm so sorry," chipped away at the fragile composure I'd constructed. I caught glimpses of others, my husband's colleagues exchanging quiet nods, distant relatives fanning themselves in discomfort, all oblivious to the tension twisting like a snake in my chest. The contrast was suffocating, their calm, orderly behavior versus my internal chaos. As the officiant began speaking, his voice echoing in the cool air, I felt disconnected from the ritual itself. The eulogies, the prayers, the controlled sobs, they were all part of a script written long before my grief, long before the secrets buried alongside my husband. And then, I noticed the way people shifted in their seats when someone entered, a man, unfamiliar, yet intentional in his approach. He moved with purpose, eyes scanning until they landed on me. The hush of the funeral seemed to grow louder in his presence, and an unsettling awareness crawled over my skin. Even as the world performed its ceremony, a nut tightened in my chest. The funeral, with all its solemnity and expectations, was nothing compared to the questions I sensed were coming. And I knew, deep down, that when this stranger reached me, nothing would ever feel the same again. The external decorum could not contain the storm of what was about to unfold. My life, which had seemed closed with the finality of the coffin lid, was far from over. In fact, the real reckoning was just beginning. The murmur of the funeral crowd seemed to fade as the stranger drew closer, his steps deliberate, almost measured. He wasn't dressed in the customary black of the mourners. Instead, he wore a dark gray suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the overcast day, giving him an unexpected authority. My heart stumbled, not with fear, but with an inexplicable recognition that something about him demanded attention. He didn't glance at anyone else. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, were fixed solely on me, and with every step, the knot in my chest tightened. He reached the edge of the group and paused. For a moment, he just observed me. His expression was unreadable, neither hostile nor kind, yet it carried a weight that unsettled the air around us. I could feel the faint tremor of anticipation coursing through my veins, a prelude to a storm I could not yet name. The whispers of the crowd seemed distant now, the polite handshakes and condolences muffled by the pounding of my own thoughts. Who was he? And how did he know me or know things only I could possibly know? Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but carrying a precise urgency. "May I have a word? Something only you can answer." Those words struck me with a sudden clarity, like lightning across a gray sky. My mind raced. Only I could answer. Who else would he be speaking to? Why me? The words were simple, yet the implications were vast. The funeral, which had seemed to mark an ending, now felt like the threshold of something entirely unforeseen. I glanced around. My mother-in-law was distracted, still offering comfort to someone else. Friends and colleagues were busy exchanging condolences. No one else seemed to notice. And yet, my instincts screamed that this was not a casual interaction. It was a pivot point, one that would tilt the course of my life irreversibly. I found myself nodding, almost automatically, as if my body understood before my mind did. The stranger stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only I could hear. I need information that only you can provide. It's about him, about your husband. His gaze never wavered. A chill ran through me, equal parts dread and curiosity. Every fiber of my being warned me to resist, to retreat, but I was rooted in place, held there by the gravity of his presence. The contrast between the serene ritual surrounding us and the storm he had brought with him was dizzying. The orderly procession of grief had suddenly collided with the sharp edge of the unknown. He paused, giving me a moment to gather myself or perhaps to test my resolve. His eyes scanned mine, searching for hesitation, for cracks in composure. But there were none to show. I had learned long ago how to mask uncertainty, how to appear calm even when the world inside me was shattering. And yet, this was different. He was not a mourner. He was not a family member. He carried no pretense of decorum, only purpose. Everything you knew. It might not have been what it seemed, he whispered. My breath caught, my fingers tightening around the edge of my dress as if holding on to reality itself. Questions that had been buried now clawed their way to the surface. What did he know? How could he possibly know it? And, most unsettling of all, why had he chosen this moment, at my husband's funeral, to reveal what he did? The crowd around us moved in slow motion. Their words, their condolences, their polite gestures, all became distant noise. I realized, in a way I could not ignore, that nothing after this encounter would be ordinary. The stranger was a catalyst, a key turning in a lock that I had not even known existed. The funeral, with its grief and ritual, was no longer the center of my world. The true story, the real reckoning, was about to begin, and I was standing at the edge of it, unarmed but unflinching. ***, the stranger's eyes never left mine as he stepped closer, lowering his voice further, as if the very words might be devoured by the air around us. I need you to remember, he said, the last conversation you had with him before everything changed. My stomach clenched. The funeral had felt like the final chapter, a punctuation mark at the end of a story I thought I understood. But his words suggested otherwise. There were hidden lines in that story, lines only I could read, lines that could rewrite everything. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My mind raced backward, sifting through memories like fragile glass shards. The mundane moments suddenly took on new significance. The way he had smiled at me that morning, the way he had held my hand during breakfast, the subtle tension in his voice when discussing finances. Was this what he wanted me to remember? My pulse quickened, a steady drumbeat that echoed the growing realization that the stranger had knowledge I could not yet grasp. He leaned in slightly, not menacingly, but with an intensity that demanded attention. What he told you, did it feel complete, or were there gaps, inconsistencies? His words were carefully measured, each one a scalpel cutting through the fog of grief. I hesitated. Could I admit that there had been unease, small anomalies I had dismissed in the moment, that I had trusted his words even when doubt whispered in the corners of my mind? I shook my head, almost involuntarily. I thought I knew him, I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the distant murmurs of the crowd. I didn't realize there were parts I wasn't seeing. The stranger nodded, as if he had expected no less. There was a calm authority in his demeanor, a confidence that unnerved me yet drew me in. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, folded envelope. He did not hand it to me, only held it up for me to see. The paper looked ordinary, yet in that moment, it seemed charged with electricity. This was left for you, he said. It was meant to be found when you were ready. It contains questions that only someone who knew him intimately could answer. Your answers will reveal the truth. He tried to hide. My fingers itched to reach out, to take the envelope, but a part of me hesitated. The world around me, friends, family, mourners, all dressed in their black mourning attire, was oblivious to the tension between us. The solemnity of the funeral contrasted sharply with the electric charge of revelation he carried. It was as though reality itself had split, one half continuing in polite grief, the other spiraling into a mystery I could not ignore. I finally nodded, slowly, deliberately, and the stranger's lips curved in a faint, approving smile. He stepped back, just enough to give me room to breathe, yet his presence still loomed like a shadow at the edge of my awareness. Answer carefully, he said. The truth is in the details, not in emotion. Do not let grief cloud your judgment. Everything depends on precision. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neat handwriting that felt both familiar and alien. The first line read, "What did he fear most? And whom did he trust with his secrets?" My heart skipped. Fear? Secrets? The man I thought I had known, the husband whose absence now weighed heavily over me, had layers I had never imagined. As I stared at the words, the crowd faded entirely. My mother-in-law's soft cries, the polite whispers of friends, the black-clad figures all around. They became part of the background, almost theatrical, as if the true stage was now this small space between the stranger and me. With this paper as the script of revelation, I could feel my mind opening, sifting through memories, emotions, and intuition, trying to match patterns. There was hesitation, yes, but there was also clarity for me, and understanding that what he had left behind was not just a puzzle, but a key to unraveling hidden truths that would not only redefine his life but mine. The stranger's gaze did not waver, silently reminding me that time was passing, that my responses mattered, and that the path forward would not wait for grief to settle. The first question lingered in the air like smoke, curling and twisting, demanding answers, and in that silence, a fragile but undeniable resolve formed within me. I was no longer just a widow. I was the keeper of truths that demanded to be revealed. The stranger nodded once more and walked away slowly, disappearing into the crowd as silently as he had arrived. And there I stood, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of both responsibility and possibility. The funeral, once a finality, had become the starting line of an unexpected, uncharted journey. The envelope trembled slightly in my hands, as if it sensed the weight of the revelation it carried. I took a deep breath and unfolded the single sheet of paper again. The words stared back at me. What did he fear most? And whom did he trust with his secrets? My first instinct was to dismiss it as some macabre game, but deep down, I knew it was far more deliberate. Every detail of my husband's life, every whispered word, every subtle glance over the years, all of it was now under scrutiny. I retreated to the quiet corner of the funeral hall. A small bench by the stained glass window, away from the murmur of grieving voices. Sunlight filtered through in fractured patterns, highlighting dust particles that danced in the air. The contrast between the serene beauty of the light and the chaos unraveling in my mind was striking. Here, amidst polite sorrow and ritual, I was embarking on a journey that none of the mourners could even perceive. I closed my eyes and allowed memory to surface, sifting through moments both mundane and significant. There had been nights when he seemed restless, tossing and turning, muttering under his breath as though some invisible weight pressed upon him. There were times when he double-checked locked doors or hid away documents that seemed trivial at the time. Fear. Yes, there had been fear that he never revealed. Fear he disguised with charm and confidence. But fear of what? Of failure? Of exposure? Or of someone close enough to unravel him? I recalled one evening, just weeks before his death, when he had confided in me briefly about a work matter, his voice unusually tight. He had trusted me, just enough, with a detail he would never have revealed to anyone else. In that moment, a shiver ran down my spine. Could this be what the stranger meant? That my husband's secrets, the very essence of his hidden life, had always been tethered to my presence without me realizing it. Opening my phone, I began reviewing old messages and emails, scanning for any anomalies that might correlate with the question on the envelope. There were subtle things, cryptic texts, sudden cancellations of plans, small sums of money transferred at odd hours. Nothing screamed betrayal, yet in combination, a pattern started to emerge. The seemingly ordinary life I had shared with him was dotted with small, deliberate omissions, invisible threads of secrecy. I felt a pang of betrayal, not fully directed at him, but at the illusion I had been living under. The contrast was stark. In public, he had been the charming, reliable husband, the one everyone admired for his composure and grace. At home, the person I had known, loved, and trusted carried shadows of a hidden life, one that I was only now beginning to map out. I pulled out a notebook and began jotting down each small clue. No matter how trivial it seemed, the unusual late-night phone calls, the receipts from places he claimed he had never visited, the subtle inconsistencies in his stories, each piece of evidence, each recollection, was like a thread that, when woven together, could expose the tapestry of secrets he had kept. The stranger's words echoed in my mind. Precision matters. The truth is in the details, not emotion. Hours passed unnoticed. The funeral continued around me, a backdrop of ritualistic mourning, while I pieced together a narrative only I could see, and with each realization, my grief transformed and diminished, but sharpened into focus. I was no longer simply a widow. I had become an investigator of the life that had ended too soon, the life that had concealed truths beneath layers of charm and routine. Finally, I paused, pen in hand, notebook brimming with observations and deductions. The first secret was beginning to take shape, a subtle revelation that neither anger nor sorrow could fully encompass. It was not just about betrayal, it was about understanding him, truly, in ways I had never allowed myself before. And as the last guests began to leave the funeral hall, I realized that this was only the beginning. The envelope had promised questions. I had found the first answers, and the next step, I knew, would plunge me even deeper into the mystery of my husband's hidden life. The funeral had ended, but the echo of hushed condolences and polite whispers lingered like a stubborn fog. I stepped out into the cold afternoon, clutching my notebook like a lifeline. The stranger, who had approached me, his eyes calculating, almost predatory, had disappeared among the departing mourners. And yet, the envelope's questions burned in my mind, demanding answers. I couldn't ignore it. I had to follow the trail, no matter how unsettling it might become. Back at home, The apartment felt different, smaller, quieter, yet filled with the ghost of his presence. His belongings, now seemingly innocuous, had begun to assume significance. Every photograph, every letter, every casual item that once represented comfort now seemed like a cipher waiting to be decoded. I opened a drawer where he kept his personal correspondence. Most of it was routine: bills, invitations, mundane notes, but one envelope, yellowed and tucked at the very back, caught my eye. There was no return address, no signature, just a symbol embossed on the corner, a small key intertwined with a letter R. I hesitated. Curiosity warred with a strange apprehension. Could this be related to the stranger's cryptic questions? I slipped the envelope open. Inside, a single card, a name and a date, handwritten in an elegant, precise script. No explanation, no context, just a clue dangling in front of me, teasing the edges of understanding. I sank onto the sofa, the card trembling in my hands, and let my mind wander. Who was R? Was it a colleague? An old friend? Someone from his past? And the date, was it a meeting, a transfer, an event I had never been privy to? Each possibility twisted like a coil inside me, a tension that demanded attention. I realized that uncovering this second secret would require more than observation. It would require deduction, intuition, and perhaps courage I wasn't sure I possessed. I revisited my notebook, reviewing the first secret I had unearthed: financial inconsistencies, cryptic communications, small omissions. They were pieces of a puzzle that now demanded a second dimension. The first secret had revealed him in the realm of money and deception. The second hinted at connections, relationships, alliances hidden beneath the surface of our shared life. He had carefully curated the narrative of his life, one I thought I understood. But with each new clue, the facade cracked further. Determined, I began mapping everything visually. The notebook became a network of lines and dots, connecting people, places, and events. Patterns emerged. The mysterious R wasn't just a random presence. This person intersected with multiple aspects of his life, some professional, some deeply personal. My pulse quickened. The stranger's words resonated with renewed urgency. Whom did he trust with his secrets? I was beginning to see the answer. I paused to reflect. The contrast between the outward appearance of normalcy and the hidden web of connections he had cultivated was staggering. In public, he had been affable, dependable, admired by colleagues and friends alike. Behind closed doors, he had been calculating, guarded, weaving a network of confidants, accomplices, and perhaps The duality was almost surreal. A man divided between perception and reality, between charm and cunning. Night fell, casting long shadows across the room. I couldn't sleep. The card lay beside me, a small yet potent symbol of the second secret, waiting to be uncovered. I traced the handwritten letters with my fingers, imagining the person who wrote them, imagining the life my husband had led beyond the reaches of my knowledge. Each possibility felt like a thread leading into a labyrinth. The entrance now unlocked by a stranger in an envelope, and then a realization struck. This was not merely about betrayal, or even discovery. It was about agency. I had been passive, observing, documenting, understanding, but the clues demanded action. I would have to follow them, carefully, deliberately, without letting emotion cloud judgment. Each revelation was a step closer to the truth, and each step carried risk. Yet beneath the apprehension, I felt a strange exhilaration. For the first time since his death, I sensed control over knowledge, control over narrative, control over the shadows of his life that had once terrified me. I placed the card back into the envelope, notebook open beside me, and whispered into the empty room, I will find you, I will understand, and I will not be unprepared. The apartment remained silent, but in that silence, I felt the stirrings of purpose. The second secret was no longer hidden. It was a challenge, a call to uncover the unseen, and I was ready to answer. The knock on the door was soft, almost tentative, but it made me startle nonetheless. My heart had been racing ever since I had found the second clue, the card with the mysterious R and the date. And now it seemed as if the universe had conspired to push me further into this labyrinth. I crossed the apartment silently, each step deliberate, and opened the door. There he stood, the stranger from the funeral, his posture calm, almost casual, yet his eyes burned with intent. May I come in? He asked, voice measured, betraying nothing. There was an authority in his tone that forced compliance. Yet I hesitated. My instincts screamed caution, but curiosity, the very force that had driven me to open the yellowed envelope, urged me to step aside. I nodded, and he entered, glancing around the apartment as if cataloging every detail. His eyes lingered on the notebook, the card, the subtle traces of my late husband's life that still clung to the air. I have questions, he said almost conversationally, but there was weight behind those words, the kind that makes one pause. Questions that only you can answer. I swallowed, forcing calm. And why should I answer them? My voice was steadier than I felt. I could sense his calculations, the way he was gauging my reactions, testing my limits. There was a methodical rhythm to his presence, a deliberate tension he built with silence. He smiled faintly, as though he had anticipated the question. Because you want answers, and I hold pieces of the puzzle you don't yet see. He reached into his coat and produced a small folder, worn at the edges. He placed it on the coffee table between us. The sight of it made my pulse quicken. I recognized the same precise handwriting, the same subtle attention to detail that had marked the envelope I had found earlier. I studied him carefully, noting his calm exterior against the storm of questions I felt inside. This was not a casual visit. It was an interrogation, and yet, strangely, he offered no threat. His approach relied on strategy, not intimidation. "Start where you think is right," he said, gesturing to the folder. "The answers are in the order they need to be seen." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents, photographs, and notes, references to meetings, coded messages, financial transfers, each page built upon the last, forming connections that I had only glimpsed before. "Who is R?" I asked, barely above a whisper. The stranger's eyes met mine with a steady intensity. "Someone who shaped parts of his life you never knew existed. Someone he trusted and who might have known more than he ever admitted." His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. I realized then that my late husband's carefully curated world was more complex than I had imagined, and each layer revealed by this stranger was both illuminating and terrifying. He guided me through the documents with meticulous care, highlighting patterns, linking seemingly innocuous details into a coherent narrative. Each revelation was accompanied by subtle contrasts. The loving husband I had known versus the calculated man who had maneuvered behind closed doors, the warmth of family life versus the cold logic of hidden alliances, my grief versus the clarity I now felt. For hours, we traced timelines, connections, and discrepancies. The stranger asked questions that forced me to confront uncomfortable truths. Why had certain meetings coincided with unexplained transactions? Who benefited from these hidden dealings? And most importantly, what had my husband intended for all of this? Was it deceit, a secret obligation, or something more sinister? By the time night fell, exhaustion mingled with exhilaration. I realized I had been underestimating my own capacity to observe, analyze, and deduce. The stranger, once a source of tension and unease, had become a guide into the labyrinth of truth. I no longer felt powerless. I felt methodical, precise, and in control. Before leaving, he placed a hand briefly on the folder. "Remember," he said, voice low, "truth has a way of finding those who are ready. You're ready now. But every answer you uncover will demand more of you emotionally, mentally, strategically." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the dim light of my apartment. The folder opened before me. The second clue had led me to him, and he had illuminated paths I had never seen. The next step, I knew, would require courage, patience, and strategy. But one thing was certain: I would not walk blindly. I would not be surprised again. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the encounter settle. A strange sense of purpose had taken hold, a resolve to navigate the web of secrets with clarity and precision. The stranger had returned, yes, but he had also handed me the tools to confront what was hidden, and I was ready. The folder lay open on the coffee table, its contents spread like a map of deception. Each document, each photograph, each note formed a lattice of hidden intentions and secret actions. I traced each line with my finger, almost as if touching them could make the truth tangible. My mind raced, connecting names, dates, and transactions, piecing together a story that was both shocking and inevitable. The man I had loved or thought I had loved was not entirely the man I had believed him to be. It started with the finances. Transfers I had once dismissed as routine, now revealed as deliberate diversions. Each dollar, carefully documented, told a story of secret arrangements, hidden debts, and alliances I had never imagined. I saw the pattern clearly now. My husband had been leading a double life. His public persona, a careful construction, while in private he had navigated clandestine dealings that involved people I had never met. The photographs were more telling than any document. Casual snapshots from social events, meetings, and dinners suddenly took on a new meaning when juxtaposed with receipts, bank statements, and coded messages. Faces blurred into a network of silent accomplices, and I began to understand the depth of manipulation that had been orchestrated around me. Every interaction I had witnessed, every explanation he had offered, now felt like a carefully scripted performance designed to keep me unaware. I felt a surge of anger, not the fiery, impulsive kind, but a cold, calculating fury. The kind that made me sit upright, pen in hand, ready to record and dissect every detail. For the first time since the funeral, I felt fully alert, fully awake. This was not about grief anymore. This was about clarity, about reclaiming control from the chaos he had left behind. Then I saw it, a small, unassuming document hidden among the papers. A letter, unsigned, referencing a name I recognized from the funeral guest list. It contained a warning, a note that could only have come from someone close to the truth. My pulse quickened as I read it again. Whoever had written this had known the whole story, had known my husband's secret life, and had wanted me to find it. I realized that the stranger had been right. The clues were leading me, guiding me. But it was not just about discovering what had been done, it was about preparing for what must be confronted. I could not remain passive any longer. The network of deception, the hidden alliances, the careful planning all demanded a response. A confrontation that would strip away illusions and force the truth into the open? I gathered the documents, stacking them neatly, each piece a weapon in its own right. My hands were steady, my mind precise. I rehearsed the confrontation silently, anticipating every argument, every denial, every attempt to manipulate. I knew now that truth, when wielded correctly, had a power that emotion alone could never match. The doorbell rang again, this time with urgency. I knew who it must be before opening. My husband's closest associate, the one whose involvement had been hinted at in the letters and financials, stood on the threshold. There was no casual pleasantry, no hesitation. The moment demanded honesty, demanded accountability. I need to know everything, I said before he could speak. There was a pause, a hesitation in his eyes, a recognition that the quiet, grieving widow he had underestimated was no longer passive. Everything, I repeated, and he nodded, realizing that concealment was impossible now. What followed was a cascade of revelations, explanations, confessions, and admissions that exposed the full extent of the hidden life. Every carefully guarded secret, every whispered promise, every diversion of funds all emerged under the weight of my calm insistence. I observed, I recorded, I understood, each detail building a complete picture. By the time the conversation ended, the air was thick with truth. There was no need for shouting, no room for argument. The confrontation had not been explosive, it had been surgical. Every fact, every document, every witness aligned perfectly. The deception had been unraveled, layer by layer, and the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. I leaned back, exhausted but resolute. The stranger's guidance, the clues, the painstaking research all had led to this moment. The truth was finally in my hands, not as a source of pain, but as a tool. And I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that what came next would be a reckoning conducted not with emotion, but with precision and strategy. The courtroom was quieter than I had imagined it would be. Every eye seemed to follow me as I walked in, not with fear, but with a calm authority that surprised even myself. I carried no anger, no desire for revenge, in the reckless sense, only evidence, meticulous and unassailable. Each folder, each page, each highlighted detail was a testament to hours of patient observation, careful documentation, and silent strategy. Kevin entered soon after, his usual confidence faltering the moment our eyes met. I could see the doubt creeping in, the first hint that the illusion of control he had relied on was slipping. He had believed that my grief would render me passive, that my mourning would make me pliable. He had misjudged the quiet woman, the one who had spent years understanding every nuance of their life together, every financial movement, every human interaction. Harold Whitman. My lawyer nodded at me silently, a subtle signal that it was time to let the truth speak. The judge, a stern woman with an air of patient authority, gave a brief glance at the pile of documents before her. It was in that charged silence that I felt the balance of power shift. Whitman began. He did not raise his voice. He did not embellish or dramatize. He laid out the evidence with clinical precision. Bank statements showing transfers to accounts I had traced, receipts for lavish gifts that were never intended for me, and notes that revealed alliances and secret arrangements. Each piece of paper was a step closer to clarity, a step that left no room for denial. Kevin's lawyer attempted to interject, but Whitman held up a hand, allowing only the evidence to speak. The judge examined the documents carefully, flipping through each page, her expression changing from professional neutrality to one of realization. The courtroom was suspended in tension. Every whisper of paper, every click of the pen marking evidence, resonated with the gravity of truth being unveiled. As the story unfolded, I watched Kevin shrink into his seat. He had always believed appearances could substitute for honesty, that charm could mask deceit. But charm and lies have no standing in a courtroom where documentation and facts reign supreme. The mistress, the hidden accounts, the secret meetings, all were laid bare, undeniable, and meticulously verified. By the time Whitman concluded, there was no room left for manipulation. The judge's voice carried both authority and resolution. The assets purchased from my inheritance were recognized as my separate property. The financial misconduct was documented and weighed. Restitution was ordered to correct a diversion of funds. Each ruling felt like a carefully measured victory, a precise correction of imbalance rather than a theatrical punishment. Kevin remained silent, a hollow figure of entitlement undone by methodical truth. The courtroom felt smaller, charged with the electricity of a story that had been long obscured, finally emerging with clarity. I felt no triumph in malice, only satisfaction in justice, in the recognition that patience, observation, and strategy could accomplish what confrontation and shouting never could. Outside the courtroom, the world seemed quieter, not because it had changed, but because I had. The weight of deception lifted, leaving a clarity that was both exhilarating and sobering. The stranger, the one who had approached me after the funeral, watched from a distance, satisfied but unobtrusive. Their presence had been the catalyst, a gentle nudge towards uncovering the truth that I had been too immersed in grief to see. For the first time, I allowed myself to breathe fully. My husband's death had been sudden, cruel, and shrouded in secrets, but the aftermath had revealed not only the depth of betrayal, but also the strength I had carried silently for years. I had been underestimated, overlooked, and assumed powerless, but in silence and precision, I had reclaimed control. As I stepped into the cool afternoon air, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows and illuminating a path forward. The restitution, the acknowledgement of hidden wrongs, and the exposure of lies were not just legal victories, they were personal affirmations of resilience and clarity. I realized that closure was not loud, it was deliberate. It was not revenge in the traditional sense, but the courage to let truth, meticulously gathered and patiently presented, become the ultimate force of justice. I walked away from the courthouse, no longer burdened by grief alone, but empowered by knowledge, strategy, and the certainty that the next chapter of my life would be guided by clarity, not deception. The courthouse steps were quiet now, the echoes of judgment lingering in the air like a fading storm. I paused, letting the weight of the past weeks settle around me. Grief had been my constant companion, a heavy, invisible shroud I had carried from the moment my husband had died, but now, mingled with the lingering sorrow, there was clarity. The chaos that had once seemed insurmountable was now laid bare in the light of truth. I thought about the stranger who had approached me after the funeral, the one who asked questions only I could answer. Their presence had felt intrusive at first, almost a cruel reminder that life would continue even when I wasn't ready. But in hindsight, I realized they were a catalyst, a quiet force that had nudged me toward action. They reminded me that grief could coexist with agency. That morning did not mean surrender. Walking through the quiet streets, I noticed the details I had long ignored: the way sunlight refracted through leaves, the soft hum of distant traffic, the rhythm of my own steady breathing. For the first time in weeks, I felt a connection to the world outside my grief. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something more profound: presence, awareness, a sense that life could still unfold on my terms. The past months had taught me lessons I would never forget. I had discovered reserves of patience, observation, and strategic thinking I didn't know I possessed. The betrayal I endured, the meticulous uncovering of lies and deceit, had not hardened me into bitterness. It had refined me. Each spreadsheet, each bank statement, each carefully documented transaction had been a step toward reclaiming power, not through confrontation or rage, but through precision and clarity. I thought about Kevin, the man who had underestimated me, who had assumed my silence equaled ignorance. He had believed that charm and confidence could mask truth. But truth is patient, relentless, and unassailable when it is approached with care. Justice had not been swift, but it had been thorough. The restitution, the acknowledgement of misdeeds, and the exposure of deception were more than legal victories. They were affirmations of my own resilience. As I returned home, the apartment felt different. It was quieter, yes, but in that quiet, there was space. Space for reflection, for healing, for planning the future. The grief that had once seemed suffocating was now tempered by a newfound sense of agency. I realized that loss and empowerment could coexist. That one did not negate the other. Sitting by the window, I allowed myself a moment of gratitude, not for the circumstances that had led me here, but for the strength I had found within myself. Life had a way of testing us, of placing impossible choices in front of us, but it also offered moments of profound clarity. I had learned to listen, to observe, to act with precision. I had learned that silence is not weakness, and patience is not passivity. The future stretched out before me, uncertain yet inviting. I did not know what the coming months would bring, but I felt equipped to meet them. I had seen the worst of betrayal and emerged intact. I had uncovered lies and transformed them into understanding and power. And in that transformation, I discovered something enduring: the quiet, unwavering strength of a woman who refuses to be defined by grief or deceit. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, I realized that endings are rarely abrupt. They unfold slowly, quietly, leaving behind not only closure but a deeper understanding of who we are. My husband's death, the betrayal, the courtroom battles, they were all part of a story that ended not with noise or anger, but with clarity, resilience, and the courage to continue. In that quiet, reflective space, I understood the true meaning of closure. It was not revenge. It was not spectacle. It was the steady, deliberate reclaiming of life, piece by piece, truth by truth. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to imagine a future, unburdened, unafraid, and fully my own.